Good morning, everyone, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to the IGC India Conference, Evidence for Inclusive Growth. The London School of Economics has been directing the International Growth Centre alongside Oxford University now for 10 years since its founding. We are incredibly fortunate that the IGC has been supported and championed by the UK's Department for International Development, who came up with this idea of getting the world's best economists to work on the poorest people's problems and giving developing countries access to the world's best economic advice from an independent source. The IGC has also been supported by the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation here in India, and we're very grateful for their partnership. We are incredibly proud of the successes of the IGC, led by our Executive Director, Jonathan Leap, who you'll hear from shortly. And its unique model of bringing top economists and policymakers together to define practical policy solution based on evidence-based research has proven to be incredibly successful. It now works in over 20 countries across South Asia and Africa, including India, for the last 10 years, and has now countless examples of success, both in producing world-class research, but also in producing real-world impact. And today is an opportunity for us to showcase some of the transformational ideas that have been developed by researchers under the auspices of the International Growth Centre. For us at the LSE, the IGC is a perfect place to call the LSE home. The LSE has just launched a new strategy for the next decade, which we call LSE 2030. And the motto of our strategy is shape the world. We want to be the social science institution in the world that has the greatest global impact and be the place that trains the people and creates the ideas that shape the world. Today's sessions will look at a whole variety of solutions that have shaped the world in various ways, including challenging policy issues in India, ranging from expanding access to electricity, social protection and food assistance, pollution and climate change, and expanding the labor market. India is an extraordinary laboratory for social scientists, both because of its success in economic growth and lifting millions out of poverty, but also because innovations in India vary enormously across states, and there is a rich body of scholars in India to work alongside to analyze what has worked and what hasn't. It's also why the LSE and the IGC are investing in the next generation of Indian researchers whose ideas will contribute valuably to moving the academic frontier. So IGC's India program is providing funding and training to Indian PhD students, for example, and building the capacity of policymakers to use evidence in their day-to-day decision-making. So thank you for joining us today and letting us share with you the transformative ideas that the IGC has been developing. And I'm going to hand over to Jonathan now, who will tell you a little bit more about IGC's activities in India. Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Minouche. And let me add her words of welcome, my welcome as well. We're delighted to be here. As you know, this marks 10 years of IGC's engagement in India. Our engagement in India began when the IGC was founded as one of the very first programs that we established. As Minouche indicated, the IGC works closely with policymakers using frontier research to generate new ideas and innovative policy solutions to support inclusive and sustainable growth. And today, in today's program, you'll see a variety of examples of this across a number of different key policy areas. What's unusual about the IGC as a research center is that we combine an international network of world-leading economists with a set of country offices across Africa and South Asia. And what those offices enable us to do is to establish long-term relationships with policymakers and other stakeholders. And on the basis of those relationships, really to understand what our research agenda should be. we bring together the sort of knowledge generation that policymakers are responsible for and so able to undertake with the knowledge generation of researchers to generate solutions that wouldn't really happen otherwise, to generate ideas that wouldn't enter into policy discourse if it weren't for that combination of policymakers and researchers working together. As Minouche said, we're very grateful to both the UK Department for International Development and more recently the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support of our activities here in India. It's actually particularly apt that we're in India to mark our 10th anniversary because this was, as I said, one of the founding programs of the IGC and certainly one of the very most active programs. Early on in the time of the IGC, 25% of the research we commissioned globally was commissioned here in India. So India's been a hugely important source of new research, and we've been very pleased to be able to work with researchers across India to invest, as Minouche was saying, in the new generation of researchers across India as part of all this work. This conference launches our 3-month celebration of IGC at 10. The point of the celebration is really to showcase some of the transformational ideas that have been generated since our founding. And we'll have events scattered around the globe and involve a number of different events and new communications there. It also coincides, I'm pleased to say, with a new grant from DFID, which is both the largest ever and the longest ever that we've received and will take us through to 2026. So we're very pleased to continue this partnership with DFID. But pleased also to be working with a range of new partners, and the most important of those in recent years has been the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've enabled us to establish a range of new activities and engagements in Bihar, where the program is focused. We've established both winter schools, which are helping to train middle-ranking civil servants in Bihar, but also continued to offer summer schools to help offer training to young academic researchers, both in Bihar, but also here in Delhi. Many of our most important ideas have been generated here in India, and we'll have some examples of that during the program today. But just to cite a couple, one of them, it was here in India that the fundamental research was carried out that highlighted the importance of management practices in constraining growth in developing countries. We'd known for a while that management practices were an important driver of growth in developed countries, and we knew from survey evidence that developing countries tended to have much worse management practices than developed countries. But no one had really put together compelling evidence for whether there was a causal linkage, and work done here demonstrated that interventions to improve management practices in firms could have a very significant effect on productivity, profits, and growth. The paper that really produced these results is perhaps the most cited of all IGC papers, with more than 1,000 citations. But there also been fundamental work here, and I don't know if Michael's in the room, but we're going to have Michael Greenstone will be speaking later on, and he's done fundamental work on how adjusting regulatory practices can curb carbon emissions and curb pollution in effective ways. We've also done work most recently about using machine learning to fight tax evasion in Delhi, and already those learnings are being carried through our programs to 2 countries in Africa, as well as other states here in India. So a lot of exciting ideas that the IGC has had the pleasure of being associated with have been generated right here in India. During today's energy panel, you'll hear from Michael, Robin, and others about a provocative new idea that we need to change social norms around energy in order to solve the problem of access. We'll also hear in the very first session this morning some new evidence about the effectiveness of social protection, but also about the approach to social protection that raises some fundamental questions about how government policy should be should be designed. After lunch, we'll have a panel of experts to discuss climate change, one of the most pressing issues facing both India and, of course, the world. And then the final session will be on the labour market here, including how best to support women's labour force participation. Our hope is that today's conference will help stimulate some new thinking and some new conversations around solutions to some of India's most pressing growth challenges. I'm now pleased to hand back over to Minouche and to the panelists for the first session. Thank you.
So let me start by introducing this first session on social protection transfers and the role of food assistance. The last couple of decades have seen a massive increase in social protection spending in low and middle income countries around the world. It's basically doubled in the last 20 years, and so now the number of countries that have unconditional cash transfer schemes has gone up from about 72 to 149. 43% of countries, of low and middle income countries, now have conditional cash transfer schemes, which are linked to things like school participation and immunization. 80% of developing countries have school feeding programs. 67% now use public works as a way of providing social protection. So there has been an absolute revolution in the expansion of social protection programs around the world. And India has been at the forefront of this trend. India has introduced a vast array of programs ranging from cash and in-kind transfers to workfare and subsidized insurance and pensions for widows and the disabled. And those programs are now reaching a significant proportion of the population. 50% of children in India now receive school meals. 29% of rural households get some income from public works. 22% of widows are now receiving a pension. And many states have implemented many innovations, and there have been many reforms to try and improve the effectiveness of those programs. And as I said earlier, India has become a laboratory for how you can learn about what social protection programs work or not. I think overall, though, there is a sense that the returns to the spending on poverty reduction have not reached their potential. And there have been various issues: corruption, leakage of subsidies, implementation challenges, and the perennial debate about targeting. Now, food is an especially key priority for obvious reasons, for leading a healthy and productive life, but it's particularly important for children and for reducing child malnutrition and the long-term productivity and lower health costs that results from making sure that children have adequate nutrition. Now, India has a large and complex array of food assistance programs, which include the targeted public distribution system and one of the largest safety net, which is one of the largest safety net programs in the world, as well as the take-home rations program, which focuses on child nutrition. And these programs have dual objectives: promoting price stability for farmers and providing food security for consumers. Today's panel is going to discuss some of the recent financial, technological, and institutional innovations that have been attempted to make these programs more effective and have a greater role in social protection, and in particular, these food assistance programs in India. We're going to start with a presentation by Robin Burgess, who will present evidence from Bangladesh on why poor people stay poor over long stretches of time and how social protection can be designed in a way that breaks this cycle of poverty. After Robin, I'm going to move to the other panelists, and I'll introduce them one by one and direct some of the questions relating to Robin's research to them to get insights from them on their work, their perspective on India. So let me turn to Robin to start us off.
Basically present an idea today supported by some evidence, which I think is important in the sense that it points to a new approach to welfare, which I guess you would characterize by saying it's a big push approach, that you have to make quite significant transfers in order to move people permanently out of poverty. Why it's sort of fundamental to economics is that for a very, very long time we've had this notion of there being poverty traps in the world, and that notion has remained largely theoretical. So today I'm going to be presenting some evidence from IGC-supported work in Bangladesh that suggests it's actually a real concept in the world. So let me just begin with some preliminaries. So I think the first thing to notice is that when we look at poverty around the world, it's really striking how obviously there's been improvements, but there's still the numbers in millions below $1.9 on the right. That really the huge concentrations of poverty in the world remain in Africa and Asia to a very striking degree, and within Asia, particularly in where we are now, South Asia. And why that's doubly important is that if you look at population growth predictions, population growth will also be occurring in Africa and Asia. So there's a dual problem, not just of getting people out of poverty in these regions, which is the two big regions where the IGC works, but also about how to prevent people who are coming into populations from becoming poor. So there's what we call a stubborn poverty problem, that if we have this goal of not just reducing but eliminating extreme poverty by 2030, which is not a long way off, and there's this huge problem about how do you address that question even as countries grow, as they are, as India is, for example. And what we find when we look at the data we gather in Bangladesh suggests is that there's a very strong link, which you also find in all the Indian data, between occupation and poverty. Okay, so there is the bulk of the poor around the world, when you look carefully at the labor data, are engaged in what you might call casual work. So in India, there's a huge section of people working as day laborers in agriculture and elsewhere. Himanshu, Nick Stern, and others have studied this very carefully in one village in Uttar Pradesh. And we need to understand why people stay poor in order to design policies. And so much what I'm going to get at today is this notion that you need to change the production activities of the poor to get them out of poverty. So you can make transfers to the poor which will raise their consumption somewhat, but if those transfers are removed and their production activities or employment activities remain the same, they'll fall back into poverty. So the big idea today is there some way of lifting people permanently out of poverty through a sort of big push approach? So let me turn to the sort of two views of poverty. So the first view is that what you might call the Republican view of poverty, which is that people are poor because they have traits that make them poor. Okay, so there may be low ability, low talent, maybe behavioral problems. There's many, many reasons, but the fundamental reason is that they're poor because of their traits. Okay, and that's what we call the equal opportunity view. So it's not that there's not a misallocation of talent. People are as productive as they can be. It's just that some people are more productive than other people. Okay, so that's sort of view one. And then in that sort of view, the poor are doing these casual, unproductive jobs because they don't have the innate talent to do anything else. So it's nothing to do with there being a lack of opportunity. It's all to do with just that is how productive these people are, and that's hence why they're doing these very unproductive jobs. So let's call that the Republican view, or the equal opportunity view. And then the second view, which is, or you could sort of call this one the more right-wing view as well. And this is a sort of a notion in an animation of what we mean. So if people have the same innate talent, they can all, even if they start at different positions, get to the same standard of living. Okay? So it's not that there's anything stopping them, they just have to slowly climb that hill. But the other view, which we might call the sort of Democrat or left-wing view, is that actually that's not the case. The reason that some people are poor and some people are rich is they have different access to opportunity. And that is basically a fundamentally and diametrically opposed view to the equal opportunity view. And so under this view, some of the poor at least have the innate talent to engage in stable, productive work, but they face barriers that prevent them from doing so. And people in this room can think of many barriers. It could be credit, it could be you need to buy a bulky asset, and so forth. But what's interesting is that this there's a misallocation here. So there's people here who could be much more productive, but are unable to become productive because they're facing some barrier to doing so. So in this animation, you have two people. So you have wealth at birth on the bottom and wealth today on the side axis. And the person who's born poor faces some insurmountable task to getting to a high standard of living, whereas the person who's born rich continues to climb the hill just as in the first case. Okay? So what's interesting is if you draw a line, what we're saying is that this is the poverty trap view of the world. So the people to the left, even if they are as talented as the people to the right, cannot get to a high standard of living. So if we think a little bit more concretely about this, what we're saying is that, and in the case today, we're going to look at a case where in villages in Bangladesh, the very, very poor women, because they're assetless, they certainly don't have land, but they don't have any assets, and 93% illiterate, they're simply unable to move into doing the work of the richer women, which is livestock. So the poor women in Bangladesh, as also the case in India, are doing things like being day laborers, domestic servants. So basically, their only endowment is labor, and the way they employ that labor is in the only form that they are offered employment, which is as casual laborers. So then they have no secure employment. They have no stable employment. They're simply hired by the day, and if that demand for their labor evaporates, they face many, many difficulties. But what's fascinating is that those two women could have exactly the same talent. Okay, but in one case, the woman remains poor. In the other case, the woman becomes rich because they can accumulate assets from the surpluses engaged in this more productive form of employment. They climb the hill, the other ones fall back. So those are the two views, and I think it's worth emphasizing here two very important things that differentiate the views. The first is it's clearly unfair. The poverty traps are unfair because people who have the same talent end up with different standards of living simply by an accident of birth. Okay, so that's the first thing. And the second, which is important for growth, and has been emphasized a lot with regard to involvement of women in the labor force, is that it's also inefficient, because highly talented people who are born poor will not be able to exploit that talent. Okay, so what I'm going to do in the remaining few minutes is to simply discuss a test of which view pertains in the world. The world being a bunch of villages in Bangladesh. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an asset program called the graduation program. Some people will be aware of this program. Myself and Oriana Bandiera, who's, by the way, also the director of the state program for the IGC, and others were involved in some early evaluation of the graduation program in Bangladesh. But today I'm going to focus on trying to differentiate between those two views. So the basic idea you want to think about is that in some villages, so all villages, we identify the ultra poor that are the beneficiaries, the near poor, the middle, and the rich. And then we shock some villages by giving the women in the ultra poor group a large amount of assets, essentially a cow, and training to go with operating a cow business. Okay? And what's fascinating about that, and entirely fortuitous if I'm honest, is that the transfer was big enough that it allowed some of the women to cross that poverty trap threshold and some of the women not to. And so we can actually test, because under the poverty trap view, the women that crossed that threshold will climb. They'll get out of poverty. Whereas the women who don't, even if they're exactly the same traits as the ones that climb, will remain in poverty. They'll fall back. So we can use this large asset transfer program to test between these two views of poverty. So let me just give you a tiny bit of background, which is extremely important. So firstly, one of the innovations in the evaluation, which began in 2007 and is continuing today, we're actually looking at the children of the women that received the program, is that we recorded all the hours worked for everybody in the village, not just for the poor. So this is the different groups, the ultra-poor, the near-poor, the middle class, and the upper class in each of these Bangladesh villages. And a couple of things are very striking. The first is that the ultra-poor almost entirely work as casual laborers, either in agricultural labor or as domestic servants. But as you move across the wealth distribution, there's a progression heavily towards working in livestock. So in other words, the richer, the middle and the rich women in the villages work in livestock, which requires an asset, livestock, whereas the poor women just sell their labor in spot labor markets, either as agricultural laborers. The other thing which I'm not going to show today is that the asset distribution is such that the women to the left, the poor women, have no land, they have no assets, they're almost entirely illiterate. So there's basically a movement towards more stable, productive employment as you move across the wealth distribution. So what we can do, and this looks a little bit technical, but it demonstrates the point that we can use the transfer, which is the yellow, and under the equal or Hill equal opportunity view, when you provide that transfer, what will happen is that people will move up to the point where the blue line crosses the black 45-degree line. So this would be the equal opportunity or right-wing view. So wherever you start to the left in that whole distribution, you will converge up to the point where the black and the blue line cross. However, it's a very different, if it's a poverty trap, it's very different, because if you're below the threshold, the K hat, then even if you receive the cow and the training, you will fall back, okay? So that threshold is defined basically by the value of the cow and some complementary assets like a rickshaw to get fodder in, a shed, and so forth. Whereas if you're to the right of the K hat, you will grow out of poverty. So we can use this transfer program where women basically start with different initial values of productive assets, which includes lands, assets, and so forth, to see which view pertains. And basically, this is the data 4 years after, and what you basically see is exactly a picture of a poverty trap. So in other words, if you move beyond, it's a log scale of 2.34, which is roughly the value of a cow, and complementary assets, if you end up after the transfer above that threshold, then you grow out of poverty. In other words, 4 years after the program, you're richer than when you were before. So you've grown out of poverty. And we're now, as I said, tracking the women all the way to from 2007 to 2018, and you see them increasingly growing out of poverty. But the women to the left, who start with a lower value of productive assets, fall back. So this is a demonstration, and one of the first sort of credible ones that's been done, that a poverty trap exists in the world, but importantly for this panel, there's a need to provide a large transfer to get people above that threshold, because if you don't provide a large enough threshold, you're simply going to fall back. So in the last couple of minutes, let me just say a couple of things about misallocation and policy. So the first thing is that if we use a model to calculate the optimal allocation of labor. So the first is livestock, third is mixing wage labor and livestock, and the third is just wage labor. The poor, which are in the dark blue, are misallocated. So there's they optimally about almost 90-something% should be doing livestock according to their traits, but only about 20% are actually doing that. So this is at baseline, before the intervention. So it's clear there's many women, to put it very simply, who could be operating livestock businesses, but because they don't have access to that large, chunky asset, they're not doing that. They're doing something where they're less productive. And interestingly, the program basically, so this is now after 4 years, the program brings them much closer to their optimal allocation of labor. So it reduces misallocation. Okay? And in other words, you are now harvesting more from the talents of these women. It's not that they were unable to operate livestock businesses, it's just they did not have the assets to do so. And then finally on policy, just to sort of take out the main points, the existence of a poverty trap implies that transfers, you have to have large enough transfers to push people above that threshold. And what I wanted to really emphasize before I finish is, we're not saying it has to be asset transfers. So in this particular case, in this rural economy, we're saying moving women into doing livestock is good because it makes them more productive. But you can imagine another large transfer, say, of human capital, which is something BRAC, the NGO we worked with on this, is trying out in Bangladesh. For example, providing enough training for somebody from the countryside to become a pharmacist in Dhaka. That would be another thing that would jump them over that threshold and allow them to exploit their talents. And the second thing, which is more depressing, but in this case it's true, is that small transfers might increase consumption for a short period, but they'll have no long-lasting effects. In other words, if you don't change the production activities of the poor, you're not going to get them permanently out of poverty. So it goes back to why the distribution of assets is so important in determining employment. And this is a graph which kind of demonstrates this. So this is the BRAC transfer, is the one in blue. And what this is saying is that basically, this is the share of the households that in Bangladesh really get above that poverty threshold, is that BRAC was pretty good at getting the majority of people above the threshold, not everybody, and hence had a huge impact on poverty. But if you make lower transfers, and then we're just benchmarking this against Enrigas and microfinance, typically transfers are much, much smaller magnitude. So you can see that this is in proportion to per capita expenditure of the household. And what that means is that the amount of the transfer over $1,000 is really a very large transfer. But importantly, you only have to do it for a time-limited period. In this case, 24 months. And then you can stop making transfers. So it goes very much back to this idea that there's the two approaches. You can either just maintain people on a higher level of consumption by constant transfers, or you can have a big push that then lifts them out permanently because now they become productive enough to do things which would stop them from being poor. And it looks like in this particular case, you need to do that by providing a very, very large transfer. So to finish, I think the key conclusion, which I think is extremely important, particularly in a context like India, is that there's a misallocation of talent. That is essentially the fundamental point that arises from the poverty trap view. And it's not that poor people are unable to take on more productive employment activities, they just lack the needed capital. And the existence of a poverty threshold implies that only transfers large enough to push beneficiaries past the threshold will reduce poverty in the long run. So if we take it sort of back to the SDG 1 and so forth, International Growth Center is all about growth, and that's great. But there's another side to things, which is these women, if you look at the control villages that didn't get the transfer, their movement out of poverty was incredibly slow. So to have any chance of really eliminating, if we're serious about that, you're going to have a dual approach. And today we're going to be talking a lot about the kind of bottom-up approach, where you're going to have to take action for people who would otherwise be left in poverty to lift them out of poverty, as well as having economic growth that lifts the majority out of poverty. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. Just checking on sound. Thank you, Robin, for that fascinating presentation. Now I'm going to turn to the panelists and ask them both to react to your presentation, but also on wider issues on social protection design. And I'm going to start with Kalyani Raghunathan. Kalyani is a research fellow in Poverty, Health and Nutrition Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. She completed her PhD in Cornell in 2015, and her dissertation focused on the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India. So she's worked very much in this area of social protection. And Kalyani, I wanted to ask you, what is your view on the impact of cash transfer schemes on the delivery and uptake of nutrition interventions in India from your examination of the conditional cash transfer scheme? And what view does that give you relative to the perspective that Robin has given on the trade-off between cash transfers versus asset transfers?
Okay. Conditional cash transfers are not new in India. There have been a lot, even from the early 1990s, that have looked largely at impacting sort of what we would consider to be underlying determinants of nutrition. So things like women's empowerment, women's education, delaying early marriage and so on. And there have been some assessments of the impacts of those. For example, the Apni Beti Apna Dhan scheme in 1994 in Haryana, which have shown that there have been improvements in postnatal investments in the girl child and also some improvements in child height. But the more recent spate of nutritional sort of cash transfers that have had explicit nutritional outcomes as goals have sort of started with the Janani Suraksha Yojana in 2005 and onwards. And evaluations of the JSY have shown dramatic improvements in institutional delivery and birth registration. There's also some evidence that they've reduced significantly neo and perinatal deaths, so infant mortality impacts, and then some evidence also of impacts on breastfeeding practices. And then more recently, we've had the spate of maternity benefit schemes that perhaps are more relevant from the perspective of what's happening today. So the IGMSY, the Mamta scheme in Odisha, then the Bihar Child Support Program, and then more recently PGMSY as well. And I think because these programs have come into the policy space much more recently, there's been less quantitative, rigorous evaluations of their impacts. But we have seen in our own sort of primary data collection and our analysis of the Mamta scheme that providing conditionalities on the basis of which cash payments are made significantly improves adherence to those conditionalities, unsurprisingly. But that if you look at additional sort of soft conditions that rely on supply side services to be available, for example, breastfeeding practices or use of counseling services, then we see a much smaller impact on those. And so I think what the interpretation I would take away from this is that we can think of cash transfer schemes as relaxing demand side constraints, but if the supply of services and the supply side constraints are not met, then there's only so much that we can expect that cash transfer to do. And more broadly in the research that IFPRI has been doing, it's not just the cash transfer or the food transfer that matters, it's coupling that transfer with information on how to use the cash or how to use the food or how to reallocate resources within the household that really has long-term sustainable impacts.
And what about making sure that the most marginal and poorest households are able to access services in order to use cash effectively?
Yeah, so that's a great question, especially in the Indian context. I would think of the answer as having two different aspects. One, of course, which is not new to anyone who studied cash transfers, is that the more complex, the more lengthy your procedural requirements are to be able to access the cash or access the food, the more likely you are to be excluding the poorest or the most marginalized, precisely the group that you're aiming to target. And so what is it that we can do to make cash transfer schemes much more simple and easy to use? And I think there's a role here for digital technology, for mobile apps, to kind of bridge that gap and make the paperwork easier to navigate. The second is, again, to speak to the kind of supply side aspect that especially in the Indian context, there's a lot of evidence that says that access to health services, access to ICDS services is inequitable. And so you end up finding that it's the poor and the marginalized who aren't able to really use those services. And recent work we've done on the ICDA shows that it's the poorest quintile that is significantly less likely to access the ICDS relative to even the second or third or the middle quintiles. And so what is it that we can do to make sure that the supply of services is equitable and can be accessed by all, especially the poorest and marginalized, so that the conditions that we're imposing on the cash transfer can easily be met.
Thank you, Kalyani. Let me turn to Dr. Himanshu. Dr. Himanshu is Associate Professor in Economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and his research currently is focused on the measurement of poverty and inequality in India. Dr. Himanshu, I wanted to ask you about the issues around corruption and the effectiveness of the social protection schemes in India. We've heard lots of numbers about how much leakage there is, how much is lost, but on the other hand, also growing evidence that many of these programs are improving. What's your view?
I mean, this is a fact that most of the programs of public service delivery that we have had some kind of a corruption. This is not only for a public distribution system, but any other program that you look at it, you will find that there is some kind of a corruption which is there. But you're right that in many of the programs, particularly in the public distribution system, there has been a steady improvement over the years. And some states have been doing really well, and these are things which are known. We don't have a current assessment of what exactly happened after 2011-12, particularly after the National Food Security Act was implemented. So we are still waiting for the consumption expenditure data to come out, which has not been released by the government as of now. But at least if you go by the evidence from the states, it seems to have definitely led to reduction in corruption or the leakages that we're talking about. So I think that's an issue which is definitely going to work. And I think Kalyani made a very important point, which is true for not just cash transfer, but true for every other program. And the more complex and the more complicated you make it to access the programs for the poor, the more corrupt it is going to be. I mean, for the poor, the simplest it is to access it without any barrier. That is the best way of reaching it out. And that's what the states have shown, actually, where it is universal without any conditionalities. But what we have now done is that we have actually basically started using multiple layers. I mean, you have the Aadhaar, you have the biometrics, you have the various other infrastructure that you have to use it. I mean, that's the irony that we talk about poor, and that's, I'll come back to Robin's point in that sense. The poor to be like the really, not just the capital starved, but also digitally to be not that illiterate. I mean, the literacy level is not very high, but we extend to the highest level of literacy in terms of digital things. And then we expect them to be really the smartest guys to access all the technologies that is available, which even, I mean, take the example of GST, I mean, like maybe a very simpler solution. Businesses are finding it difficult to adapt to those ones, but we want the poor to be really the smartest guys and access all the technologies in the big way. I think the second point which Robin was pointing out and didn't elaborate on that was the issue that you pointed out, in that if you are giving cash transfers in that sense, a small cash transfers will push you up the poverty line for some time. That's not something which is going to make a substantial difference. That's something which comes out from the study very clearly. And I think food interventions in that sense are seen in terms of the intervention that he's talking about, the human capital interventions, the nutrition interventions. And in those terms, making them accessible to a larger population, making sure that they are able to access it, has definitely longer lasting impact on their ability to move out of poverty traps than simply giving some amount of cash and measuring it in terms of their incomes going up. And I think that point has come out, the really structural changes that you're talking about. And really our agenda in that sense, I mean, our public delivery programs, at least with the NFSA, were moving in that direction. But currently, I think we are in a situation where the poor are really struggling, surviving because of the way the economic situation is working out. And it's also the approach of the government in that sense on NREGA, for example, or on food service delivery. We really have stopped talking about these interventions of lifting people out of poverty and try and make it as simple as possible for them to really achieve these objectives in the longer run.
So the government in India has been pushing for the growing use of biometric authentication to reduce misallocation of funds in these programs. What's your view of the role of biometric?
I mean, it's very clear in the sense, nowhere in the world, I mean, technology is not the solution for any kind of a corruption. If you're thinking about it, then probably you can make the GST or biometrics or anything as complicated as possible. But I think it's basically a trust. I mean, again, the point that Robin was talking about, the very first slide, about the innate abilities. What we have an assumption is that the poor, by design, are cheats. I mean, that's something which is not going to work. That doesn't work. I mean, democracy particularly is a trust, contract of trust between the citizens and the state. And if you look at the way corruption has come down in states, for example, Tamil Nadu and other places, it was without biometrics. I mean, it was not something where you had to use the Aadhaar to take corruption. It has to be a balance between these two. What we have done is that we have actually gone overboard, in the sense by using the same administrative machinery with more degrees of complexities and more sophisticated tools, or maybe face identification, iris identification, all sorts of things, to try and control the leakages. But I think what will basically solve the problem, and this is enough evidence on that, and IGC has also worked on these things, is that if you make people the participant in that process, that works far more. And poor are far more serious about making sure that the facility that they're getting is preserved. They would not like to fritter it away by simply, I think they are stakeholders, and if you look at it that, I think there are better ways of doing it rather than, and recent 2 years, I mean, these last 2 years, number of people who have been, I mean, there's starvation deaths which have happened because people denied because their fingerprints were not matching, because they didn't have access to food because of various other technical problems, network connectivity and those kind of things. Those are things which we need to think about much more seriously than what we're thinking about. And remember, communication is not something which is given. I mean, there are places where communication can be taken off. Last 30 days there has been.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me now turn to Ramesh Chand, who's a member of the National Institution for Transforming India. He has a PhD in agricultural economics from the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in New Delhi, and has much experience in research and teaching in the field of agricultural economics and policy.
Thank you.
So let me start with the agricultural development agenda and what policies you think are necessary to provide food security, and how you see these social protection programs in that context of providing food security in India.
Thank you very much. In fact, agriculture sector in last 30-40 years in India has seen tremendous change, which is not even acknowledged by many of the researchers, and that has implication for food security, and I will say even for inclusive development. One change which has happened is that we have moved in a big way from supply deficiency to demand deficiency. In 70s, India was just producing 1 kg food per person per day. Even with so much increase in population, recently we are producing 1.7 kg food per person per day. But if you look at demand side, I will not say that 1.7 kg is more than adequate to give nutrition, but we have a serious problem of demand deficiency. Again, there are so many reasons for it, but this factor means that from supply deficiency to demand deficiency, and these two require different approaches to address. So this is one big change. Second, in case of agriculture, we know that after 91, in India, non-agriculture sector has seen acceleration in growth, but agriculture growth continued to be almost the same. There is some movement of labor and farmer out of agriculture, but it has been very small. So as a result, you just find that farmer income continued to increase at almost same rate during last 30-40 years, but non-agriculture per worker income witnessed accelerated growth. So because of that, this feeling in agriculture, this feeling of dissatisfaction, rural distress, it's not that income in agriculture has not grown, but relative to non-agriculture. So this is the second major change which has implication for development agenda. Thirdly, in India, we have lot of technological change, but nature of that technological change has been such that it was production increasing, it was not cost decreasing. So in most of the crops, we have that data from cost of cultivation, that with increase in productivity, average cost of production has increased. And if you want to sustain growth in the situation when average cost of production is increasing in a real term, you are required to give higher and higher prices, higher and higher prices. So today India has reached a situation where much of the agriculture is not globally competitive because much of the growth has been driven by increase in prices, improvement in terms of trade, but not by technology. Technology played role that it created possibility of having higher productivity, but with much higher use of input. The last point which I would like to make in this agenda for agriculture, that over time the dependence of agriculture for public support and public intervention, rather than declining, it has increased. It has increased in a big way, whether you look at subsidy, whether you look at the percent of total produce that is procured by public agencies. So that has been rising in almost all these spheres. So new development agenda is looking at all these, that how we can address this, how we can go for sort of say demand creation through export promotion, through food processing, through augmenting income of low income people so that there is a more demand in the economy, seeking more of private intervention, investment in agriculture, making changes in regulations. So completely different kind of development agenda is under consideration. I would just like to react briefly to that presentation on Bangladesh. Again, it is not based on my research, but it is based on my observation. India tried all those kind of things, giving cows to people, giving buffalo to people. It was the major component of our IRDP, Integrated Rural Development Program, under which the main philosophy was asset transfer, but that asset was only livestock, either buffalo or cows. So after two calving, you just find that productive capacity of cows or buffalo is not there. Problem of fodder, a poor fellow doesn't have land, from where you get fodders. So you just found that, but Himanshu said that temporarily the person might have come out of poverty as their income might have increased, but after 2 years he is back to that situation. In contrast to this, if you look at the households who are leasing in lands in rural area, landless people, poor people who are leasing in land and doing cultivation, I find, this is my observation, I come from a rural area, I go to my farm every month and I observe, and I found that those poor people who are leasing in land, though it is not formally recognized in India's system because of various reasons, I find that their income is much higher, and you just find that they are more or less permanently out of that poverty trap. So land issue to my mind is very, very important.
I want to come back to Robin, and now that you've heard views of India's experience in social protection, what do you think? Resources are scarce, governments have to make choices. Between the kind of support to current income and current consumption that's prevalent in the cash transfer schemes versus support to continuing agricultural development versus the kind of asset transfer programs that you're talking about, which would you think are the most effective? And if you had to make a choice, which would you put your resources in?
I think that there's no doubt that programs like NREGA, where people have periods of low demand for their labor because they're stuck in these types of jobs that I was describing, have played a useful role in terms of insurance in India. There's lots of evidence for that. I think going back to what Mr. Chand was saying is that we need to think a little bit beyond that, and I think in two respects. So the first is clearly, if we're talking about stunting or impairments to cognitive development, then you have to have interventions that, which address that. But by looking beyond, I think it's really coming to what Mr. Chand was saying, which is that we need to think about accelerating structural change in the economy. And in my example, that was all within agriculture. It wasn't like we were moving out of agriculture. People are moving simply from casual labor into a more productive use of the labor. But I wanted to emphasize two things. One is that the set of subsidies, as has already been indicated, have become very diverse in India. And I think that may be limiting the ability to go for more of a big push type of intervention for the poor. And I think it's also important to note that those subsidies are not limited to the poor. So later on today we'll be talking about energy. A lot of those subsidies in energy, whether it's electricity or fuel, are all across the income distribution. In fact, they're concentrated on the richer people. So those are sort of wasteful because they're not even addressing anything to do with poverty. They're just there, and they got there, and they're stuck politically. So I think there's a need for some sort of consolidation. On the point of going towards some sort of structural change, which could be more productive agriculture, it could be services, which is really the big driver in India. I think what I'm getting at is nothing specific to asset transfers. It could be, as I said, that you provide some training, vocational training, to allow people to be able to do a different job. But you need to have that focus upon people doing different work, because remaining and it could be, for example, in Bangladesh, where we've now followed them for almost 12 years, the women who they get a choice of assets. Many of them chose livestock because I think they observe other women doing livestock. But once they operate the livestock business, they start to buy land or lease land. So that's the sort of next step in what they do. They start to get rickshaws to rent. They begin to accumulate assets. Because fundamentally, if you look at early development economics in India, it was all about land. It was all about land. And that is the key thing that differentiates the poor from the rich in the villages in Bangladesh. So we're really dealing with just moving people a little bit up, but at least to a point where they're not suffering, forms of malnutrition and so forth. So I think I don't have the answer saying this program is better than that program, but I do think there's a need to kind of consolidate transfers so that there's a sort of a focus upon engineering change in the work that people do as a result of receiving that transfer. There's a need to curtail people in the top or middle to top of the distribution enjoying those subsidies or transfers, and hence have a much more focused approach on saying we want to accelerate the speed at which people move into more productive employment in India. Because it has been, in some respects, glacially slow. And I think if you look at poverty, if you look at growth, you just chart it out. Basically what you see is that agricultural per capita has been basically, growth in agriculture has been keeping up so that it's sort of constant. But the thing that's really driving things is the services and manufacturing, particularly services. So I think we also probably need to get over this hang-up that you have to have manufacturing to get to higher development. Many countries are now getting to higher development through services, and there's a lot of evidence that productivity and services in India have been improving very dramatically.
Let me just go back to the panel for reactions on, it seems to me that there's a set of social protection interventions which are basically around supporting people's human capital, nutrition, education, kind of health interventions, which make people's human capital endowment wealthier. And then there's a set of transfers around physical capital, giving people assets like cows or land or other things. That, of course, economists would say these are complementary. Human and physical capital are complementary, and therefore you get improvements in people's welfare if they have a bit more human capital and also access to some physical capital. But I wanted you to say a little bit about how you see that, and where is state intervention most effective in that attempt to try and increase the capital that people have in order to progress in society. Maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Raghunathan.
No,
No? Should I start with, would you like to, anyone who'd like to go first?
I think a very relevant question in the sense. Bangladesh is a good example for this, in the sense in the last 30, 40 years, if you look at it, India has done very well in terms of income. Growth of incomes, per capita incomes, also we have done pretty well. But if you look at the indicators and the human development indicators, and most of them, and it might appear to be a small intervention, for example, which Robin did talk about, is the women. Look at that. And we have a situation where the period where our growth had accelerated, our women workforce participation rate had actually gone down, gone to the lowest in the last 45, 50 years.
Yes.
But even if you look at, say, for example, on infant mortality, on nutrition, on various other indicators, Bangladesh has done stunningly well in the last, and they're doing well in the growth terms also for the last 2 years. Even on that, they have done well. But I think those interventions are the ones which are important, and those do require specific interventions. Assuming that incomes would automatically translate into achievements in those indicators also, or those dimensions also, is not something that is coming out. Look at these two countries which are, in a sense, the basket cases of that. And I think the Bangladesh is now reaping benefits of those interventions which went in for quite some time. And there were specific interventions, and those interventions went into all dimensions that we're talking about. Right from making access to credit, to education, to all sorts of indications. I think, let me just point out to one single fact which is very important. It's not about capital versus that, and I think at some level that is just by giving education and everything, that deficiency is not going to. So those structural interventions that Ramesh was talking about or Robin was talking about are probably required, and we do need to have those kind of interventions. But that intervention is meaningless if you're not putting up the same kind of an effort or putting the same kind of money into those efforts. So I think the causation is very important. It's not something that is something which is necessary condition. And we have to distinguish between those two.
Any other panelists want to say anything at this point?
Just to build on what you said, if my mic is working. If one is just to look at health and nutrition and looks at the UNICEF framework, there's no denying that it really is, all of these things are complementary. There's a whole network and interweb of really complex factors that have to work together and work sort of in interaction with one another in order to affect the ultimate outcome. And so just to agree with both of you that it's not that we can do one or the other, but that they really have to work simultaneously and in cohesion to affect. Yeah.
I think at this point I might turn to the audience and see if there are any questions here. So let me gather up maybe 3 questions, and then I'll come back to the panel. I see a couple here. I'd like to have a woman. Aha, there's a woman in the back. Why don't you start us off, and then I'll take the 2 gentlemen here.
Thank you so much, panelists, for this great discussion. My name is Prarthana. I'm an assistant professor with the Department of Economics in Prastha University. So, hearing around all this discussion, there has a lot of weight that has been assigned to holding assets, right? Which gives you a push out of that poverty trap. But if I look at the case of India, where in the rural sector, where even the people who have assets, who have lands, no transfers, no subsidies, no loan waivers have been able to hold them back to their land and stay with agriculture. A lot of migration is taking place. People or the farmers, they are forced to move out of their land to urban areas in search of daily wages or unproductive work. So, how do we address this kind of an issue?
Thank you. I'll take the 2 gentlemen right here, and then we'll do another round of questions in a moment. Right there. And great if you could just introduce yourself briefly.
My question is to Mr. Ramesh. See, you talked about the cost factor, cost of producing the agriculture produce. Okay. Now, if you go back to the Operation Flood, which was launched by Amul long time back, and they formed the cooperatives. Okay. Now, what is happening is that unless our villages form a pooling system through cooperatives, or they're adopted by the ultimate food processing big industries like PepsiCo is doing in India. This, your point of cost reduction, can't we see that this will make a major change in the agricultural income in the hands of the poor down the line?
Okay, thank you. If you could pass the mic to the gentleman next to you.
Yeah, good morning all. Well, I heard all respected panelists. I want to make my own point, like Mr. Robin said, that bulk of poor doing casual and unproductive work. Definitely, that's a true. So, as somebody has already pointed out, education. Education is one thing where the people can have the skilled labor, and vocational training, somebody again pointed out about that. So they can have the right talent and the right labor. So whatever the hidden talent is there with them, that can come out. That should come out, and they should have the access about the opportunity. So once we give their training about what are the opportunity there and what are the opportunity for the rest of the world, then they can come out with that. Second point I want to make is, now there are some barriers. Like I am from village, so barriers are like language. I did my engineering, but then because I was not knowing English much, I was totally in Hindi speaking, I couldn't appear in IIT exam and other things, but then I did from Kalyani. But there are so many my colleagues, I know they were very, very, hardworking, very expert. They couldn't come out. So those barriers like language barrier, then there can be some false cultural belief barrier, then any such sort of things that should be removed. So that can be also through the awareness, awareness and something working for that. Besides the population is again one part. We should have the minimum protection for the health and the food services also for them. See what happens, many people, because of the food and the health services, they cannot come out of their talent. I mean, they cannot show really talent because they are just drawn in that. So minimum food and protection for their health services, there should be there for those poor people.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think
one more thing.
I think if you could wrap up, I could then turn to the panel. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So let's the first question on migration, and who would like to take that one? Maybe yes. I think, why don't you take the first question, if that's all right, on agriculture and migration and the risks around people. Let me just make sure.
I remember the question. I'm just not sure I'm equipped to answer it.
Maybe shall I give you that one, actually, since it's more an agricultural question. I think you've got the first and the second, and then the third one is really how do you reduce all the other barriers and constraints that people face. Maybe I'll let you do that one, Robin. Go ahead.
Let me briefly answer all the question. I think that issue raised by assistant professor from Patna, very, very important. You see, unless we have a proper employment strategy, it will be very difficult to address poverty by giving the doles and sops, subsidies, subsidized food, etc. That is important in some context, but not so important to bring people out of poverty. Why I raised this issue of employment, I did a study which is published, maybe some of you have seen. In rural India after 14-15, manufacturing sector growth is more than 15%. Employment growth is only 0.6%. So from where that employment growth will come? Unless we link manufacturing to agro-processing, raw material, value addition in agriculture, or more emphasis on employment-intensive manufacturing, it is very, very difficult. The only option then left with rural people is, rural poor is, either you migrate to urban area or you stay poor, and government can make some intervention. I think that at one point that construction sector was booming in rural India. Again, its growth has slowed down. So I think through public works in the rural road and other kind of activity, they can make very big difference to rural poverty. Now coming to this question on agriculture, I agree that it is not only technology which matter for reducing cost of production. Institution and investment are equally important. I have written a blog on this success of dairy, and more recently I am doing a study. You will see interesting result from that study. Higher the government intervention in a subsector of agriculture, lower is the growth. Fishery sector, there is no government intervention. India's fishery sector is growing by 7%. In case of dairy, there is small intervention, very small intervention, and the growth rate is 6%. Within crop sector, there is some intervention. In horticulture, you find modest growth. When it comes to field crops, where India is giving as much as 30% as a subsidy, the growth rate is only 1.1%. So I think institutions also matter, investment also matter, and technology is another issue. So if we want to reduce cost of production, that is very important. The last comment I want to make, yes, Bangladesh is important, but in India we have so many examples like Bangladesh. You will see the states which are doing much better than Bangladesh. But then we have states, Hindi-speaking states mainly, including West Bengal, which is not Hindi-speaking. You just find that poverty is declining at a very low rate, nutrition is not improving, child mortality, maternal mortality rates either declining at a very slow rate, in some states like Jharkhand, even non-significant decline. But if you contrast that with other states, where total fertility rate is now close to 2, you find situation is totally different. So Bangladesh is good example, but I find within India, we have even better example than Bangladesh, which needs to be imitated and replicated in other places.
I'll turn to Robin to talk about the other constraints that people face. And in particular, just to add to the question that the gentleman asked, among the women in Bangladesh who got assets, were there any other traits that made some more successful than others? So everybody got a cow, or the control group, the experimental group got a cow. But were there other factors? Did they have better education? Did they have access to other assets? Did they have other advantages that made them more likely to break the poverty trap?
Okay, so let me just try to do this in order. So firstly, I mean, obviously I'm a professor, so education matters. But more importantly, the point of the poverty trap idea is in no way linked to assets. You know, if you wanted to move into something different from a village, as you were indicating, then education would clearly be one of the primary means of doing so. And even if not primary, secondary, it could be vocational training, it could be all that. And secondly, the point that I was trying to make at the beginning of the talk, which would also, I think, kind of capture what you were saying, is that the women I'm talking about, going back to Minouche's question, are median age 40 years old, 93% illiterate, all have children, dependent children. So they're not the women that are going to be going to Dhaka for the garment jobs, or they're basically stuck in the villages. And I think the primary thing that differentiated them was simply because on the bottom axis you have the initial productive assets, was whether they had something. So this could be a shed, it could be a rickshaw to get in fodder, because as Mr. Chand was saying, there's many constraints to operating these programs, and you can see across the world many failures. So I think what is of greatest importance about the BRAC program was simply, A, they didn't insist people that had cows, they had a choice of things they could do, but they were with them every week for 24 months. And they convinced these women that they could do livestock business or whatever business they chose, because, you know, like many people, you're born with a certain kind of sense of what you might do. Education transforms that. In this case, for a 40-year-old woman, a person coming to your household, going through your books, you know, dealing with any conflicts with neighbors. They even had village committees of sort of the elites to deal with problems that arose. So it was both the magnitude of the transfer and the duration. And then very, very importantly, after 24 months, nothing else. And we're now tracking them 12 years later, and they're continuing to move out of poverty. And their kids are much better off than the kids or the women that didn't receive the program. So in terms of the other, to finish up, the other barriers, when you look at a poverty trap, it could be anything that prevents you to transition. So in this country, caste could be an issue. If as a lower caste person you will not be allowed to work, say in the railroads or in construction because the supervisor doesn't wish to employ you, then that's going to keep you in poverty. Language, if you require language to move into a different type of job, then that's going to prevent you. Gender, if men don't wish to employ you because you're a woman, that will stop you. So it's not that it's specific to assets. It's literally something that is not of your choosing, for example, in the case of gender, which then, or caste, which then prevents you from moving. And I think, going back to the gentleman's point, I do think that there is a need to think of what I would call about productive welfare. So welfare that not only moves your consumption up, but actually changes your opportunity set. And I think that is difficult. And I think to finish, I'm talking about 40-year-old women. For India and for South Asia and Africa, given how young the populations are, a lot of this is about people who are not yet in the labor force. It's about that matching between people. The people are being born in the villages now, and how we're going to transition them into decent jobs, because that's going to determine the future of India and of all the African countries. How good those jobs, those people who are not even yet in the labor force are. And I think that's why I think productive welfare, if you're going to use state resources, you should be thinking not just about the level of consumption of somebody today or tomorrow. You want to think about, well, how well off will they be in 20, 30 years? And that will be determined by their employment earnings, because the bulk of the poor have no assets. So their main endowment, at least to begin with, is labor.
Okay, I think I have time for maybe 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. I'll take the woman here and the gentleman there.
I'm a professor myself and also do research. So I really feel that the main question is on barriers only, actually. Like Mr. John had talked about the talent and attitudes because of which that the people stay poor. So besides this, I feel that there are a lot of barriers within the family also. That people, not just women of course face a lot of barriers, suppression and opposition, despite being talented and everything. But even the boys also do feel the same, or they are also are subjected to the kind of suppression because of circumstances and all. So overall, the family is the main barrier for the growth of the individuals who want to grow with the opportunities that are prevailing outside.
Okay.
So can there be a policy issue which can be framed around where the people who are bonded within the home, they can freely get out and access to that? So that is the main thing I feel, because I have been running around and traveling around and talking around to many people around. So I feel this is the main thing. Barriers are, even the educated families, they also ban the woman to look to the opportunities which they can really access to. Okay. They are talented and everything, but they are not given the opportunity.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. And the gentleman here.
I have a basic question regarding the point that, the government deficits and debts and the fiscal deficit is already high. We are already hearing this Reserve Bank is transferring, some of their reserves simply because the government has come up with so many schemes, which are good on paper, but they are definitely unproductive. So why don't we focus on, as far as productivity is concerned, as far as, building a cold chain for agriculture, warehouses, etc. We have too many schools, but the teachers don't turn up. Why don't we improve the quality of the schools? Health centers, they are overburdened, but they still the doctors basically are too much focused, on going abroad, going to US, etc. Or focusing on metros. So why don't we focus on the quality and improving the infrastructure and all?
Okay, thank you. Who would like to take the family barriers question? Would you, please.
So I'm just going to rephrase it slightly and just to put it in context. But what I would call a barrier in the family context is perhaps something like social norms or cultural norms, and we do tend to see that less in the case of men, but we see it a lot in the case of women. And I think you're really right. So a lot of our work on women's self-help groups, which is really an intervention that has gone to women in the village, has one of the main barriers that they've faced in effecting change is precisely the social norms and kind of resistance within the family to change. And the only thing I can say is that it's much easier to change tangible assets, both physical assets as well as human capital assets, than it is to change social norms and cultural norms. But that in the context of one of the NGOs that we're working with, we've really seen a movement in these barriers over the course of, say, the last 5-6 years. So what is it that is preventing women from moving outside the house, from taking on gainful employment opportunities, even those that are provided by the women's SHGs? And I think, again, to come back to sort of education and information and sensitization, and when we do that kind of sensitization activity, to make sure that we include the family. So you include the grandmothers, you include the men, because that really is the only way to effect change.
Okay. And then last question, focus on quality, not quantity. Who would like to? I sense you might want to say something.
No, there is this issue of the government taking responsibility of providing these basic infrastructure, whether it is schools or it is health services. I think perfectly valid point in a sense, and the government will have to invest. There's no question of not investing on those things. And I think the point that he was pointing out is that given all of the constraints that we're talking about, we are not putting enough, and it's true for agriculture in the sense. If you look at it, Ramesh was talking about the agriculture crisis that we are in. But this is the same time when the agricultural investment also went down, and then in the government. So I think the role of the government and the kind of investment that is required, both in terms of quantity as well as quality, is absolutely important, and no amount of public transfers, individual transfers in that sense can replace the bigger investment that is required by the government.
I think it's clear, just to wrap up, that India currently spends on social protection roughly what other low and middle income countries spend, about 1.5–2% of GDP. But it's quite clear when you look at a country growing as fast as India and what's likely to happen to incomes, that spending will have to go up considerably, not just with GDP, but the share of GDP is likely to go up, because as the economy develops, the kind of skills that people will need in order to be productive in a much more modern economy will go up. And so this is a moment when really good thinking about what kind of social protection India needs in the future should be happening, because that number will go up. It will go up to the levels of 5, 10, eventually 15% of GDP. If you look at the UK budget, the welfare budget is now 40% of government spending. So these numbers get very, very big, especially when you include, a national health service and other things. So these numbers will go up, and it's critical that India grows that budget in a way that's very effective and sustainable. And so topics like this and thinking critically about how to make social protection effective in India is absolutely vital, and it's fantastic that the IGC and many people in this room are doing that work.